Welcome back to the show where Dana and I are going to talk about cluster beeps.
Beeps, cluster beeps. Yeah, let me try to do it that way.
Cluster beeps.
What is a cluster beep? Back in the dark ages when Gwen and I both went to school, where we had
Mm-hmm.
to use a mallet and a hammer to take notes and a stone
No,
tablet.
wait, a chip, like we just chip wood. I,
Yeah, back then we
uh-huh.
learned personality disorders were axis 2. We had a 5-axis diagnosis system, I
Framework or
guess,
system,
right?
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I always we learned that axis 1 was like stressors in your life, right? Axis
I
2
actually liked
was,
the Axis 5.
yeah, right,
I
right.
liked Axis 5,
Yeah, yeah,
actually.
yeah. Second, if you not everybody had an axis 2 diagnosis. That meant you had some sort of personality disorder. And if you didn't have a personality disorder, you just said deferred, like you didn't have one.
Basically a life sentence.
Yeah.
Go
And then
ahead.
there were 3, 4, 5. I won't get into those. But they changed it to calling them cluster. No, now it's called cluster A, cluster B, cluster C for personality disorders. And then they have these descriptors for each. Cluster A is the classification is odd or eccentric. I think we might meet the criteria for that.
We're cluster
Cluster
A's.
B,
Uh-huh.
dramatic and erratic. Well, at
Oh,
times.
yes, that
Yeah.
can apply
And
to me
then
at times.
yeah. Cluster C, anxious slash inhibited. I think we could
Check.
meet the criteria for these at any point in time.
So
Um,
basically, we're cluster. Oh, that's
we're
the new name
clustered.
for our
We're
podcast.
clustered. We're
Loosely
clustered.
associated and clustered.
Clustered. Loosely associated and clustered. We
Uh,
can't talk about personality disorders without keep in mind a reminder the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, is not written by psychologists, it's written by psychiatrists, but we all follow that for necessary diagnoses for insurance companies. But they're very damning. The reason why we want to talk about personality disorders specifically, though, in this podcast is because a lot of people that are neurodivergent get misdiagnosed as having a personality disorder. And I would say actually it's the most common misdiagnosis, whether
yeah,
it's men or women,
yeah.
really common in women to get pegged with a borderline personality disorder because they just don't know the autism or ADHD criteria well enough to not get that diagnosis. Now, why is that? What is a personality disorder, like conceptually? So the idea is like if I have a stress in my life, like I've almost lost my house to a fire, it's an ongoing stressor,
Oh, that's
right?
not hypothetical.
Not
Oh, okay.
hypothetical. It
Okay,
just
got it.
happened. It's a relatively recent event. It was obviously stressful. You'd expect someone to have X, Y, and Z symptoms having just gone through that, right? Not a personality disorder. Personality disorders, you can't give the diagnosis to someone that's younger than 18. The reason being they're personality based, right? So the theory is these become predictable ways of thinking or organizing your world, that are part of your personality, like who you are, that are, quote, defective or disordered or maladaptive, or try to come up with more pathologizing language along those lines, like the anxious, we learned in school that Axis 1 stuff, the old Axis 1, meant people come into therapy saying, I have this problem I need to deal with. But
Hmm.
Axis 2 wouldn't come into therapy, but if they did, they'd be saying, everybody in my life is the problem, but it's not my problem. So that was sort of the real pathologizing thing about Axis 2 or personality disorders is people don't know they have them and they're very resistant to change, right? Now, if you think about it, if you've grown up a certain way and you have all of these coping strategies, adaptive or not, that
Hmm.
have a recognizable pattern, so they meet the criteria for this DSM because there's a recognizable pattern. and you get sidled with one of these, it is a very damning thing, because the assumption is you're going to be difficult. You're not going to listen to what I have to say. You're not going to change, right? Because it's so entrenched in your personality. I've worked a lot with personality disorder, and they're not as unmovable as a lot of people would have you think, but people are going to be resistant if you come at them the wrong way, right?
Hmm.
So in general, if you think about someone who has a pathology, if you will, that's from how they grew up, and it's all in who they are, right? These are things that we see, like a borderline, I keep using the quotation marks for those of you who can't see me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A borderline personality disorder typically is someone who grew up in extreme trauma, where the environment was not secure, right? Sometimes you were okay, sometimes you weren't. The exposure to trauma was real. It happened repeatedly. It happened all the time. And then this sort of really confusing thing where you had a caregiver who would love you sometimes and then would also be your abuser, sort of stereotypically what would create this sort of personality. And so what you tend to see in adults is, I desperately want to trust somebody and be close to somebody, but I can't trust them and they're going to hurt me, right?
Yeah.
And doesn't it kind of make sense if you grew up that way that you would adopt that mindset, right? And so the old school, like Freud way of looking at personality disorders is that these are defense mechanisms, right? So I'm going to never get close to somebody because they're going to hurt me, right? So it's a defense mechanism. Now, if you go through your whole life like that, you might be miserable and it might not go well. But therapy is to kind of point those ideas out and say, this is kind of what you learned growing up, right? So it makes sense that this is how you're moving through the world. And let's try to disarticulate that and have you learn about yourself, and maybe slowly wade into some relationships to make sure you don't get hurt, which is how I've done work with people, and it's worked, right?
Yeah.
Um, but all of the personality disorders, all of them have an assumption of severe trauma growing up.
Yeah.
So me and my fellow trauma informed therapists have always said, is it really a personality disorder or should it really be complex trauma, right? And the psychiatrists won't get rid of the personality disorder in the DSM because it is these are categorized ways of predictable ways someone operates. So women do tend more towards what's described as borderline, whereas the male version of that tends to be more narcissism, just because of a lot of stuff in our culture and so on. And then there's like dependent personality disorder and avoidant and antisocial personality disorder. These are horrible, stigmatizing, lifelong, sticking with you kinds of things, but they all arise from horrific backgrounds. Someone doesn't come to you with that sort of presentation having had a hunky-dory childhood. It just doesn't happen ever, right? So to me, it's more like it makes sense that you would have these sort of ways of being, right? Now, why does this happen? Why do we see so much adults get sidled with these diagnoses instead of autism? I think the main reason is clinicians do not have any idea what adult autism looks like, first
Yeah.
of all. And, especially for women, come in having done a lot of research, trying to advocate for themselves, having grown up in a world that doesn't understand them. So they're leery, right? They don't trust people because they've had people screw them over their whole lives, really. Um, Feeling different, feeling alien. And that you could sort of see where that could fit into that borderline if someone doesn't know autism at all. I would say the vast majority of women that I see that see me after they're 40 have at
Yeah.
some point had this diagnosis been brought up in discussion, or they've just been fully saddled with the diagnosis, right? And then we start to look at it and say, wow, this actually fits autism better. And then I've had people tell me, but it could be both, right? Like I've had other psychologists say, someone could be autistic and have a personality disorder. And I'm just like, oh my God, I want to kill myself. Really? I don't really think so. And then there's just the whole idea of, the diagnostic and statistical manual. It really is, these are descriptors. So what's different about the DSM than medical diagnoses, like when I had my thumb thing, I've got arthritis in this thing, and it's got a diagnosis specifier in the ICD. The DSM is descriptors of patterns that people follow, and that's how we give those diagnoses. And there's no cause for any of them except PTSD. They don't talk in the DSM about what is the antecedent to personality disorders. They don't talk in the DSM about what is the antecedent to X, Y, and Z. It's just a description of what you're seeing. And isn't that kind of bizarre when you think about it? It lets you know how much we don't know about. These are too complex of these things, and that they really are various human ways of responding to trauma growing up and trying to cope with it. All of them, every diagnosis in there, depression, anxiety, all of it, except for maybe pervasive developmental disorders where there's brain injury and things like that, because some of those are in there as well. Although you could say it's because of the brain injury. It's so reductionistic and puts people, and if you, God forbid, you get a personality disorder on your record somewhere, it'll follow you forever. Like if it's on your insurance, that's all people will see anymore. They just won't see anything else. It's that damning. To me, it's so important to not give that if you're not 100% sure, and can you really ever be 100% sure? To me, the more compassionate way of looking at it is, this is how this person's coping. Now I have a sense of their pattern of coping, and now we can work on it, rather than saddling them with the diagnosis and saying how difficult they are.
I mean, I feel like that really holds tight to your Adlerian training,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
If you will,
Yep.
like, right? And
Yeah.
it's a more compassionate way of seeing people. Don't get me wrong,
Mm-hmm.
like I do think that, okay, so I think the thing that connects on the surface
Mm-hmm.
borderlines to some autistics, okay,
Mm-hmm.
is the emotional dysregulation
Yeah. Yep.
that doesn't really make sense, or it might look bigger than what you think it should look like, all of these kinds of things.
Right.
And the question there really, like in my mind, for many autistics, that comes back to like the nervous system. It comes back to like
Yep.
their neurological system and the way in
Yep.
which they're overwhelmed or processing information, et cetera. It's coming more from
Mm-hmm.
brain wiring or organicity, like, biologically how that person is made up.
Yeah, being overwhelmed and not knowing how to cope any other way, but just to kind of explode, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Borderlines come to that through trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, can we say that many autistics also have complex trauma?
Yeah.
100%.
Yep. Yep.
100%. So we can see where this gets really tricky. I think
Mm-hmm.
the diagnosis of borderline and narcissism both is, we use this word in the last episode, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's a damning diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
it is, we used to call these, by the way, characterological
Yeah.
diagnoses, meaning this is your character.
Yeah.
It is
Or your
unchanged.
personality. Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
person,
It's
right? It's
unchangeable. Yep.
unchangeable.
Yep.
This is the way you are, which is
Yep.
difficult,
Mm-hmm.
unpredictable, right? And for many, scary
Yep.
because of the way they act. I mean, politics aside, we have one of those at the helm of the
I
United
was just going to
States.
say, yeah, that men autistics who aren't diagnosed tend to get that narcissism one more, because they're just saying what's on their mind, and there's more sociological collusion with them just not giving a crap, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, and even at the helm of our country right now is someone who's like the poster child for narcissism PD.
Yeah.
And then part of me didn't want to learn these things because I don't want to have compassion for him, because I
Yeah.
really don't. He he was so screwed as a kid. He had so much trauma growing up. You can't even. It makes sense
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
he is how he is, right? I'm not making excuses at all.
It's
There,
understanding.
Yeah, it's
just an understanding.
understandable, right? It's
Hmm.
all these massive defense, and every time I see him now, I see like this little 7-year-old kid who just, I can't not see it. I'm not excusing what he's doing by any means, but you can see, for me, I could always see that wounded little kid when I'd have someone who comes and has that sort of presentation. You have to kind of get past the facade, right?
Yeah. The
My mom,
operatics.
yeah,
Yeah.
my mom, even through grad school, I thought, oh yeah, she's totally. I grew up with the borderline personality disorder mother, and I know that that was a diagnosis she was given when she was in therapy. And then in hindsight, I'm like, oh no, she's the one. She's the one I got the genetics for autism from. One, just 100%. And you
Yeah.
could see that thing where it be that sensory overwhelm. Now I can look back on it. Why did we always vacation in the same place? Why did we always go to the same place? So she could reduce all that, right? There were all those things that were there, but and she tried to cope with alcohol. You know, that was her way of trying to deal with it, having 3 little kids in the house, all under 5 at the same time. So all those things you can see, but we put this throwaway lens on someone and say, like, you're beyond help. Like if it was characterological, you're never going to change, you're beyond help.
Right.
Then can't you say the same thing about autism? You, like from our last episode, you don't outgrow it. Aren't you beyond help? Of course not, right? Humans can continually learn and grow and do things, right? We're teaching our little 1-year-old dog new tricks. You know, we can learn. Now, if all my prior learning has been hurt, doesn't it kind of make sense that it would take a while to trust again and to have some learning that isn't hurt, and then on some level that might always be somewhat of your default setting, but you can learn ways to know, oh, there it is, okay, now I can sort of
Yeah.
walk that back and bring that back. um, and when I've had people, the light bulb go on about it being autism instead of personality disorder, we just can make all these leaps, like this is what this is, this is what this is, this is what this is, and it just makes so much more sense then, right?
Yeah.
um, and why do we really need a diagnostic criteria for a recognizable group of symptoms that we don't want to deal with as a profession? We're basically giving a difficulty label. Really, all of those are just, you're beyond hope. I don't want to work with you. It's too hard to work with you. That's what those are, really,
Yeah.
when you really
I
think
mean,
about it.
this is why I think also DBT, so for those of you, dialectical
Mm-hmm.
behavioral therapy,
Mm-hmm.
which was created and put together by Marsha Linehan, whose specialty was working with borderlines, um, is such a deep, comprehensive
Mm-hmm.
uh, model. I mean, when you have like a 600-page manual, and in many,
Mm-hmm.
many ways, so many of my autistic adults um, have really resisted DBT
Mm-hmm.
participation
Mm-hmm.
because of the stigma that it has coming
Mm-hmm.
from this borderline space.
Yeah.
Even though the skill building in DBT is
Mm-hmm.
beautiful.
Isn't it just giving you're basically helping someone figure out routine
Yeah,
when it
and
really
it's
gets down
it's
to it, right?
yeah, and empowering skills, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
really great kind of how do you stay emotionally regulated and then
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
manage distress in the moment? And
Yeah.
I do like those are it's a wonderful framework and
Yeah.
it gives a lot of support. I mean, it's individual, we're group, we're
Yeah. Tons
coaching
of
when you need it.
structure.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
wonderfully structured program and but there's so much resistance to it because
Mm-hmm.
it comes from this
Yeah.
origin of of borderline and
Yeah. Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just goes to show you, like, darn, we just like people throw the baby out with the bathwater because, which
Yeah.
I don't really know. I don't. I'm sorry if that's offensive. I have no idea where that comes from. Now that I'm saying it, I'm like, but also the kill two birds with one stone is also not
That
really
one, yeah,
fantastic.
that.
um,
I want to kill any birds,
I
really.
mean,
Yeah.
well, can we just, I don't know why we're doing that. Anyway,
Yeah.
but this idea of, I mean, I'm using this example just to highlight
Mm.
how um, serious and
Yeah.
damning
Yeah.
and these diagnoses are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm thinking of, so typically it's longer term work, right? Because if you think about it, something, it's how your personality gets set down. You're not going to do that in 7 sessions. It's going to take a while. That's also the case for complex trauma. It takes a while to unwrap those things. I tell my students that um, let's just sort of, just for the sake of discussion, make the leap. And I'm going to say person, let's say someone, you can conceptualize them as having a personality disorder. Let's say someone's borderline. What you're going to get in that therapy that you might not get from someone who has complex trauma that doesn't fit that pattern of complex trauma is they're going to bring more into the relationship. You're going to have more transference. They're going to have more transference with you. They're going to, instead of saying, oh, my cousin did XYZ, they're going to come and say, you did XYZ and I didn't like it. And so that's where the difficulty label comes in with that, I think, because psychiatrists are all like, no, I'm this person behind the desk and I'm, I didn't do anything wrong. To me, though, again, from the Adlerian model, it's like, oh, let's not get defensive about it. That's great. Now I have this chalkboard that you can write on. I'm happy to be the chalkboard and say, wow, okay, what was that like for you? How did that feel? So on and so forth. But it's a jolting thing to have to deal with when you're not a seasoned therapist and you haven't learned yet to treat it as, oh, this person's projecting this onto me. I feel like I've done something wrong. And that's why I think it really gets that difficulty label versus someone saying, you said this one thing in the session a week ago and I've been perseverating on it all week. And then they come loaded for bear when you start the session. And I say, oh my God, you've been holding that all week. Whereas another therapist would be like, what the hell's going on? What's wrong with you? Right. So it really is all about the perspective change in that. And it is about that colonized pathology model versus let's understand you. And yes, it is longer term work and it's more intimate work in terms of that let someone have transference with you is an intimate thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's therapists, peer behaviorists who don't go there at all. And you do have to get a lot of training to be able to manage that because it's hard. You have to know where you end and the client begins, and you have to maintain separateness, but you have to be connected in a way that you wouldn't be otherwise. I really think that's why some people really go towards CBT and don't ever get into psychodynamic work because it just can't handle that. And I don't mean that in a judging way. I mean, it's just not their thing. So for someone who can and thrives, and I actually love when that happens because I get excited because I'm like, that's where the change is going to happen, right? That's where the good stuff is, as hard as it is. But that also, when you're unwrapping those sorts of things, people tend to do things like might engage in self-harm. They might have suicidality or suicidal thinking. Therapists don't like that either because it's, oh my God, the risk. And it's like,
Scary. Yeah.
you have to be able to say, let's talk about these thoughts, knowing that you don't have a plan or a mode, right? Okay, now let's talk about these thoughts. Whereas a lot of therapists just shut it down. They don't even want to talk about it because now they potentially liable. So I think that's where a lot of that, it's a fear of working with that person thing, why those disorders are still there and continue to be in the DSM, and continue to be misunderstood by our profession rather than, yeah, this is long term, fly by the seat of your pants work. And if therapists haven't seen this work done, they haven't practiced it, they haven't seen the outcome of the beauty of what can happen when someone goes through longer term work and then they get their life back. I've seen that over and over and over with my early training and doing group work with folks. That was just like, I was like, that's my drug, man. I want to do that. I want to do that for the rest of my life. I want to help people get there. If people haven't seen that, all they see is that it's a difficult client. Difficult, difficult, difficult. I don't want to work with that person. It's too much work. It's going to be too hard. It's too risky, right? So that, I think, if people are coming in really being autistic and they've been labeled as that, oh my God, now we have to deal with the trauma of all of that, right?
I mean, Dana, I think what you're pointing at is this, it really comes down to the composition of the psychologist or the
Yeah, yeah,
therapist.
yep.
And I am not going to pretend. I mean, I've been in my early days, I was very, very screwed by a narcissist. And it resulted in some big, big things for me professionally. And it
Mm,
really, like, it became my own trauma, my own professional trauma.
yeah, yeah.
And this is difficult to work with.
There, yeah,
Like,
it's hard. Yeah,
it's very difficult. And it because the psychologist or the therapist themselves must be in a space in order to, one, not take things personally.
yeah.
In therapy, we call this countertransference and transference,
Mhm,
and that it's both of those things are very informative for
mhm,
psychologists to use. But if we can see it as information versus a
mhm.
personal attack,
Yeah,
that's one thing. The quality, I think, of the dysregulation for me feels very different
yeah, yeah.
um, than,
Yeah, the dysregulation where someone who's borderline, who's grown up with that mistrust is this desperate, I need to connect with you, but I'm in an aggressive place, which is scary for most people.
yes, it's,
Dysregulation
yeah,
for autism is more private. People might
yes,
see it, but I'm not going after you personally,
that's right.
right? Yeah,
That's
and
right.
that's where the real difference is. Yeah,
That's important for people
yeah,
to
yeah.
understand, right?
That's
And
right.
that, though, that the quality of those things, to understand those things,
Mhm.
that's how you really start separating,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I feel like autistics with complex trauma that often have been misdiagnosed with borderline,
yeah, yeah,
they come to you and you're like, all of their aggressive tendencies are towards themselves.
yeah, yeah,
I'm the
yeah.
one that's the problem. I'm the one
Mhm.
that can't. I'm the broken one. I
Yeah,
just can't.
yeah.
Versus in borderline and both narcissism, it's everyone else's fault.
Yeah, it's all
It's
the relationship disruptions. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and that's because of their own complex trauma history.
How they grew up. Yep,
That's
that's
right.
right.
And so those are compensatory mechanisms. And
Yeah.
so, we talk about this. One, I think we just want to reduce the stigma in general
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
diagnoses.
Yeah.
We understand that we have to use diagnoses in our system. That is something
Mhm.
that we have to do in order to help our clients. Like,
Right.
there's no kind of workaround for that.
Yeah.
You want
Right.
accommodations in the collegiate setting, you need a diagnosis.
That's
You
right.
need support from your health insurance, you need a diagnosis.
That's
You
right.
want
Yep.
disability, you need a diagnosis. I
That's
mean,
right. Yeah.
I don't, there's no workaround for that right now. But
Yeah.
how can we continue to increase understanding
Mhm.
over judgment? Like, how
Yeah.
do we do that? And how do we do that as psychologists where we can really tease those things out? And I would
Mhm.
agree, when I see these types of diagnoses in young people,
Mhm. Yeah.
that says more to me about their system than about them.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it really does.
So I'm
I want to
not.
put you in a neat little box because you're a problem, and I want to put a
Mhm,
label on it and then put you on the
mhm.
shelf and not have to deal with it. Yeah.
And then in the meantime, the systems of abuse,
Mhm.
which, by the way, I don't think abuse has to be so obvious.
Right, right. Oh, yeah,
Emotional
yeah,
abuse
yeah.
tends not to be very obvious, actually.
That's right.
Those still
Or
can
neglect, by
continue.
the way, can
Neglect
result in
can,
that
right?
too. Yeah,
Those systems still can continue to live
yeah. That's right.
because the kid has become the scapegoat. And
Right.
that is something that so whenever I see those diagnoses early, I go to
Mm,
systems
yeah,
versus kid.
nice.
And then my job is to just really support that kid, even though I'm
Yeah,
not working with kids anymore. But
yeah,
that's what I've seen. So these are the differentiating pieces, though, that I think are
yeah.
important for, like, also our colleagues to understand.
I think that that differentiation that you've made a couple times now about the flavor of the dysregulation is the key. That really
Yeah,
does tell you so much
yeah,
more about what's really going on and help
yeah,
you understand yourself. What's
yeah,
getting tweaked and where is it? Yeah, yeah,
yeah. The flavor of the dysregulation, Dana. We're
yeah,
okay. Okay,
yeah.
so our new podcast title is okay. So we're just gonna. If you guys don't watch our podcast sequentially, this won't make any sense to you. But this is very in line with Dana and I. We're the
Yeah.
loose association cluster beep
Yep.
flavor of dysregulation
Oh,
podcast.
there you go. I like that. That's good.
It's very short and concise, very straight to the point.
Yep. It says it all. Yep.
Really loose associations really does say it all.
Yeah.
Anyway. I'm open to votes. I'm open to votes, friends. I'm
Yeah,
open to
yeah,
votes.
yeah. Too
But
funny.
man, that's kind of can be really tough out there.
Yeah. You know what's interesting too? I mean, if we
Yeah.
think about someone developing a compensatory strategy that looks like a personality disorder, they've developed it as they've grown up, so their neurology has become that. Isn't that another version of
Neurodivergence.
neurodivergence? I haven't seen
People
that
would
under the umbrella, but it could be.
no,
I've
and
seen
people have
complex trauma under
yes.
neurodivergence, and that's really what
Yes.
happens in personality disorders. So,
Well,
yeah.
I think anxiety and depression have also been put under the neurodivergent category.
Mhm.
And
It's all neurodivergence, really. I mean, because your
mhm,
brain is not separate from your body. They're, your
mhm.
brain, yeah. Yeah. Not to say everybody's neurodivergent. I don't mean that. But yeah, I mean, you could. The point being, you can bleed the lines of the description into a place of understanding pretty easily where everything just becomes one bucket because it's trying to understand your antecedents and how you operate
Yep.
is what it comes down to. Yeah.
Yep, it really does.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy note,
Yeah. All right.
friends,
Yeah.
we
So
yeah,
categorize your dysregulation and it'll help you.
really
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, and I think like we should have a message to our colleagues.
Yeah.
Understand the dysregulation better.
Totally. Like yesterday, I always make my salad in the morning so I don't get lazy at night and not make it and then have Cheetos for dinner instead of real
Oh,
food.
it's so brilliant. I need to do
Right.
that.
So our
Mhm.
dog likes, we have this whole ritual when I'm making the salad. She likes the red pepper pieces, but I give her
Mhm.
one, I peel my cucumbers and she likes one long peel. She's so weird. So yesterday I'm peeling it. I'm getting mad at the cucumber for not peeling the right way. Like this inanimate object has it out for me, right? So I met, and then immediately I'm like, oh, it's the time change. I
Oh,
was like,
I know.
oh, it's the time change. Now imagine, and then my mind immediately went to, what if I were a 5-year-old autistic kid who's doing that and doesn't have the brain development to recognize it was the time change? And I just throw a fit and throw everything to the ground. Now the adult is like, oh, they're having a dysregulated,
Mm,
fit. What's going on? What's going on with that kid? It's
with
the
them.
same exact, yeah, with them. It's the
With
same
them.
exact thing from a 5-year-old to a 60-year-old who can recognize it in real time and know exactly what's causing it. I was still pissed off at the cucumber, but I knew why, right?
You know, Dana. I mean, well, one, the daylight savings
Oh
is
my god.
so dysregulating.
Yeah. Oh
I
my
could,
god.
to your
Especially
point,
this one. Yeah.
I could not figure out why I was not doing well. So like all my phones and all my electronic things had changed the time already, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had set an
Yeah.
alarm. I wanted to wake up in the morning. It's a Sunday. I'm like having to work all the time right now for
Yeah.
whatever. Anyway, and I get up and I'm like, geez, I'm not well. And then I'm like going through the day and I'm doing things. And then I go to the kitchen and I'm like, what? Why? Why is this microwave wrong?
Oh yeah.
And the
Yeah.
stove,
Yeah.
they're wrong. I'm
Yeah.
like,
They don't
it's
fix
not that
themselves.
time.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
so it took me literally maybe 6 to 7 hours to go, oh my God, it's daylight
Oh.
savings. It's daylight savings. And I felt
Oh, you didn't know it.
so
Oh,
like
oh, that's
I knew
funny.
it was coming, but it didn't
Yeah.
dawn. Like I knew it was on Sunday.
Yeah.
It just didn't dawn on me. And that just might be my current mental state of
Yeah.
like being extremely fatigued and having a lot on my plate and
Yeah.
feeling,
Yeah. Yeah.
like feeling
Yeah.
very pulled. And
Yeah.
I, well, first of all, I laughed, but I really like blaming the cucumber. That's
Yeah.
actually going to be the name. So we'll call this, okay, so here's
Yeah.
the title. Here's our working title for this episode. Um, are you cluster B or darn this cucumber? That's it. That's it.
That might be too
Too
abstract for
loose,
people to
too
actually
abstract.
want to.
People,
Yeah,
yeah, they may
but the
not want
idea
this at
being,
all.
and I'll use the time change, especially the spring one, because you lose an hour. I'll use
Oh, it's
that
awful.
as a description to neurotypical people of what it's like for us when routine changes. So you remember, in the spring when you lose an hour of sleep, that's what it's like every day for an autistic person who can't stay in a routine. And then they're like, oh, so because you do live through one of those, you have a
Yeah.
big societal one. That's what it's like for us. Yeah,
That's a good one, Dana.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
good one.
yeah.
Well,
Don't
everyone, if
get don't get
you,
mad at your cucumber. Just eat it. Don't get mad at it.
well, you wanted a long peel for Charlie. That's
Yeah,
why.
yeah, exactly.
That's
Yeah.
why. Well, I need to get you a different peeler.
No, it was just a weird cucumber. That's why I was mad at it.
You're still blaming the cucumber.
Yeah, I am. There was
Okay. All
something
right.
weird about how yeah. Anyway.
On
Uh,
that note, enjoy your day, everybody. Hopefully you have a better cucumber in your life.
yeah, go have a salad and find a cucumber you don't have to peel. Maybe that's the lesson, the take home lesson. But it's
Would
a
you?
sensory thing. The peel
I
of
was gonna
cucumbers
say.
kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. All
wow.
right.
If you like to leave your favorite cucumber below, that would totally make sense given the base,
Yeah,
like
let us know.
this
Let us
episode.
know.
Just let us know.
Yeah.
I feel like the English cucumbers, hothouse cucumbers, and the Persian cucumbers tend to have a better skin to eat, but heaven forbid
Yeah.
you use the other one. And man, that's like eating a crayon
Yeah.
wax. Okay. All right. Bye, everyone. Be good to you and others.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.